over here, and welcome back to another live stream reading. Today, I am going to be continuing reading Slobberknocker, My Life in Wrestling. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten about Percy Jackson. As a matter of fact, the book is right over here, right on my bed. But the reason why I'm not reading it right now is because I actually looked at the page differences between the parts that I got coming up reading. This book right here, Slobberknocker, My Life in Wrestling, has less of a page difference compared to Percy Jackson and the Olympian, Percy Jackson, the Lightning Thief. So, yeah. We're going to continue reading this book, going into Jim Ross's WCW days from 1988 to 1993. It's going to be an interesting read, I think. But if I don't get too tired, I may read Percy Jackson and its 100-page part for it. I'm also looking forward to reading the rest of that book, honestly, because I've never been more interested in a book in my life than that. Outside of Her Perfect Family, but yeah. We'll get to that when we get to it, but for now, we're reading Slobberknocker, because that's the title of the reading video. So without further ado, and hopefully I don't bunk the camera stand too much. Also, in case you didn't know, in case you didn't hear, you're not hearing it, it is raining outside. But who cares? We're here to listen to me read, not listen to the ambience that is the rain. But without further ado, let us begin. Part 5, WCW, 1988 to 93. Chapter 27, Herd, Flair, and the Ladies in the Limo, 1988. You're dragging the good name of this organization down, my new boss, Jim Herd, shouted at me from the other side of his desk. You can't go into public and do whatever you like, he said as he threw his hands in the air. I want to know what happened in that limo, Jim. I sat there having been informed that Herd already knew full well what happened in the limo. As with a lot of times in my life where my boss was chewing me out, Ric Flair was involved in the story somewhere. A couple of months before, I had again packed up my dark blue Lincoln Continental and driven myself and everything I owned to Atlanta. TBS had taken over operations of Crockett Promotions, and they did so without skipping even a week of production. There was a short meeting led by a couple of Turner executives who said there would be some changes made, but it would be a good thing as they were bringing wrestling in as division under the Turner Broadcasting System's corporate umbrella. For me, it meant becoming a full-fledged employee, receiving corporate retirement benefits and health insurance for the first time in my career. For a guy who started off in the business field fetching whiskey and cigars, everything was going great. The move to the bigger, more modern center stage was an improvement too, as it immediately changed the atmosphere and look of the show. We still had the benefit of remaining in a controlled environment, but with more people generating more energy, which translated better to TV. On the corporate side, though, World Championship Wrestling, as it was now being called, was the red-headed stepchild of the TBS empire, so the line wasn't exactly long with Turner execs looking to run the company. This is why Jack Petrick, the top TBS executive assigned to WCW, hired his St. Louis happy hour friend Jim Herd to run the day-to-day operations. During one of their happy hour gatherings, Petrick learned that Herd had directed, among other things, Sammy Muchnick's successful St. Louis weekly wrestling show. When Turner came looking for someone to run a wrestling company, Petrick knew just the man. Jim Crockett was moved into a consulting role while maintaining a small share in the company, and Jim Herd was assigned the role of WCW Executive Vice President. Straight off the bat, Herd had a reputation for being gruff and unlikable, traits that got me heat. Yeah, Herd's way of working got me shit with the boys. Right from the start, it seemed that I was the only one who could get along with Herd, so that separated me out from the herd. The boys figured that they didn't like the new boss, so I shouldn't either. The one thing I had learned from living with my father and working for Bill Watts is that the last thing you want to do with an alpha male is butt heads, particularly if that alpha signs your checks or puts a roof over your head. No one found this out quicker than Booker Dusty Rhodes. Dusty and top star Ric Flair had regularly crossed swords over the years. It was a product of both men feeling that they knew best and both men feeling they were the best. It was a healthy struggle that boiled over every so often, and that boiling over helped shape both men's careers. In the new WCW, Dusty wanted Rick to drop the NWA World Heavyweight title in a short match to Rick Steiner. Flair wanted no part of losing the title, and certainly not under those circumstances, so the Nature Boy made noise about leaving the company just as it was trying to find its feet. Hurd, not wanting to lose his biggest star, intervened and overruled Dusty. The match was changed to be Flair versus Lex Luger at Starrcade with Flair retaining the title. Not only did Dusty lose face, but he also felt he was being held back with the new corporate policies of WCW, one of which was no blood allowed. Telling someone like Dusty that they couldn't use a little color was like telling a master chef that they couldn't use garnish. Which is true, because usually so in the world of wrestling, sometimes when a wrestler quote unquote draws blood or color or whatever, it's usually done to tell a story in some way. And it's happened in WWE wise, it happened even in the 80s, but of course, them trying to be kid friendly, they would censor it out sometimes. But it wasn't until the 1990s when they started being less censorship, when they were less worried about it, mainly because they were starting to delve into the Attitude Era by 1997-98. And so they basically would use blood to tell a story. Nowadays they don't do it as often, mainly because there was a policy ever since 2000 and ever since the Shawn Michaels versus Chris Jericho match at, I believe it was the Great American Bash in 2008, that would cause Vince McMahon to change his stance on blood use. And so basically, there would be little, if any, blood being done in the program, even in the pay-per-view matches. There wouldn't be very much blood. And if there wasn't an excessive amount of blood loss going on, they would stop the match just to make sure the person was okay, to wipe the blood off. Of course, it's pissed off fans, but, safety first, right? That's how it was. A couple of months later, while I was on commentary, Dusty booked the huge aggressive tag team of the Road Warriors to come out to the ring, double team him, and stick a spike from their shoulder pads into his eye. Dusty bled. Badly. I couldn't help but think, as I watched the blood streaming down his face, that this was Dusty's screw you to his new boss. Hurd immediately removed Dusty as booker, and soon after as talent. And just like that, Rhodes was gone from WCW. And that was the beginning of how I found myself at Hurd's desk getting chewed out. When he asked me what happened in the limo, I knew Flair had already been asked the same question. I also knew that Flair had told her the full story, and disdained her not so much as a raised voice or a slap on the wrist. Rick could say just about anything he wanted, and Hurd would grin and bear it. But me, I was no Ric Flair. Hurd was looking to take out his frustrations on someone, and that someone was me. Well, I began, it happened after you left. Flair walked into the bar just as I was about to leave, and we started talking business. It didn't end up that way, Hurd said. Hurd knew Flair and I had things to discuss because when Dusty was let go, George Scott, who was half of the Flying Scots tag team in the 1950s and 60s, and a talent executive for Vince McMahon, was overseeing creative for a little while before Rick became booker. Hurd then set up a committee around the Nature Boy to ensure fairness and balance to proceedings. It was a sound theory, I suppose, but horrible in practice. It began with Flair, Jim Cornette, Kevin Sullivan, Eddie Gilbert, and me. I was the only office person involved. I was the only one who lived in Atlanta, so as soon as the meetings began, the rest of the committee would be itching to leave so they could catch their flights home or go to the gym or to the next party. I didn't have much to leave the office for, so I stayed behind often to finish my work. Better to die of use than rust. Hearn also spent his weekdays in Atlanta before traveling back to his wife in St. Louis on the weekends. So a couple of times a month he'd pop his head into my office and say, "You fancy a meal on Turner? You can sure afford it." I wasn't really set up in Atlanta yet, so I was happy for company. I think he was too. We talked football over stout liquor and red meat. As much as I tried to avoid it, talk inevitably turned to work. This got me heat with the rest of the committee, because when Hearn would talk business, he'd usually finish up with the notes he wanted me to bring back to the booking meetings. But for now, he still wanted to know what happened in the limo. "You and I had dinner," I said, "and then you left to go home." "And I thought you did too," Hearn replied. "I was on the way out the door when I heard Flair calling me from the other side of the bar," I said. Hearn rolled his eyes. He wasn't long in the wrestling business, but he knew Ric Flair plus bar equals no one was going home early. And I didn't want to leave because I'm already seen as the office or the herds boy, so I stayed for a drink, I said, to be sociable. "Sociable? Yeah, yeah, well, that was the plan," I replied. "It's just that Rick is a little more sociable than most." When Flair called me at the door of the Omni Hotel bar, I knew there was no way I was leaving. Before even saying hello, he said he had 2 flight attendants at his table. "One for me and one for you." I looked over his shoulder and saw that both ladies were way out of my league. "I think I'll just go home," I said. "You're going home to sit in your empty apartment like a cat lady, Jimbo?" "Not happening," he replied as he turned and walked back to his VIP table. "Follow the Nate." "And then what happened?" Hearn asked. "Well, I felt a little stupid walking into the table. The 2 ladies in question didn't even seem all that interested in Rick, never mind me. "Ladies," Rick said, "this is Jim Ross, the greatest wrestling announcer of all time." Before I could challenge Flair's introduction, he was already waving at the barman to bring another bottle of Don Perignon champagne. I was a little shy and a little rusty. A man knows before he even sits down if he has a shot or not, and I had more chance of winning the world title from Flair than I did with either lady at the table. "What do you think our chances are?" Flair whispered in my ear. "I'm going home," I said in reply. "That bad, huh?" he said. Flair stood up again and increased his champagne order. Hearn was sitting across from me with his head in his hands. "In the limo?" he asked, not really wanting to hear the reply. "What happened in the limo?" "Well," I said, "that was outside. At the end of the night we were a little more than tipsy, and Rick asked the ladies if they wanted to go to an after-hours place. I walked outside with Rick while the 2 ladies walked arm in arm ahead of us. "What do you think our odds are now?" Flair asked me. "I don't know. Maybe for you the odds are good, but for me, we have to do something to raise the odds," Rick said with a twinkle in his eye and a look of devilment in his face. We got into the limo where both ladies sat opposite us. It was a little dark, but I could still see that the lady in front of me wasn't interested in me whatsoever. "How long is your layover until you have to fly out again?" I asked her. I could see her eyes weren't in my direction. She was squinting, and she was trying to make out something in the dark beside me. Flair, ever the gentleman, turned on the overhead light to help her out. Her jaw fell open. So did her friends. Both women were stunned. I turned to Flair to see him smiling, pound his punch from ear to ear what he had done. Oh no! I'm already reading the part, and I'm not liking where this is going. I'm really not liking where this is going, but I gotta read it anyway. Fuck it. Oh my god. Oh my god. This is so bad, I'm telling you. I'm just gonna say this for the record. If there are kids in the room, mute. And if you're a viewer watching this who have kids in the room, put headphones on because I don't want kids to hear this. I really don't. It's really that bad, dude. I'm telling you. It's gonna be rated R level of shit going on right now. I'm not even kidding either. He nodded down to his crotch, and I instinctively followed Rick's gaze down to see his erect penis standing to attention through his zipper. What in the name of God are you doing? I shouted. Both ladies scurried out of the car in disgust as Rick just sat there, basking in his nature boy-ness. You just whipped it out there? Herd asked me. Yep, I replied. Oh my God, that is so messed up, even for Ric Flair stand. I wouldn't put it past him though, but even for Ric Flair, that's kind of messed up, man. Herd could only shake his head. Flair had already told him. Flair had already told me that he already told Herd. Didn't matter. Herd will still couldn't understand why. That made two of us. What did you do that for? I said in the limo as Flair put his gun back in the holster. I was trying to increase the odds for you, Jim, Rick replied. That works about 50% of the time, and that's 50% more chance than you have before I pulled my dick out. And you went home? Herd asked me. I did, I replied. Last thing I saw was Flair strutting back toward the bar, and I got a taxi home. What was he thinking? Herd shouted. That bar's a corporate bar. Those ladies could have sued. Could have went to the papers. What was he thinking? I knew Herd was saying to me all the things he wished he could have said to Rick. He was also probably pissed that he just missed out on all the fun himself. Herd proceeded to rip Flair limb from limb for another 20 minutes before he finally ran out of steam and sat back down at his desk again. Jim, I said. Herd looked up from his desk. Is this a bad time to talk about my money? Yeah, I would say so because we got Herd and Ross. Jim Herd and Jim Ross. I'm going to refer to the last name for now. Yeah, Ross, this is a bad time to mention money, bro. Very bad on your part, man. Just saying. Chapter 28. Booking Committee. 1989. Of course, no matter who ran the company, the characters backstage were always the same. Some tried to peacock their way around, others kept to themselves. But having time to kill far away from home made most of the boys lose themselves a little. I got to know a lot of the roster in different towns and situations all the way up. Some I knew well, some I didn't. Others I thought I knew, but didn't. Hey, Jim, I heard a familiar voice say as I parked my car outside. I turned to see Dick Murdoch calling me. I was on my way to a booking meeting, but I always had time for Dickie. Look at this, he said as he reached into his billfold. I thought he was going to pull out some weird brand of condom or the $1 check we kept from Watts. You ever seen one before? He asked as he showed me a Ku Klux Klan member card. I'm thinking back to Steve Hofstetter talking about Ku Klux Klan card having membership cards, and he's like, "Did you know they have membership cards?" And I'm like, "Before now, no, and now this book just confirms it." No, I have not, I replied. And that was it. No follow-up, no discussion, no recruiting. Dickie just felt compelled to let me know that he was a member of the KKK. I wasn't sure if he was just seeing if he could get a rise out of me or if he was legit. He was always hard to read in that regard. This was the same man who told a lie about going to West Texas State so many times that not only did he start believing it, but the university actually believed it themselves, to the point where they invited him to play in the varsity alumni game. He never even went to school there. Okay then, he said as he walked off. I looked around, waiting for the boys to come out of the woodwork to tell me it was a rib, but no one ever appeared. Again, just for anybody who's wondering what a rib is in this situation, it's basically a practical joke on people that people like to pull on other people. But they call it a rib. I don't know why, but they just call it a rib. And that was how I'd feel for a lot of my WCW run, standing in disbelief, waiting in vain for someone to tell me what I had just seen was a joke. The booking committee went through so many changes and premonitions, I couldn't keep them all straight in my head. One thing that remained true was the heat I was catching from the members, no matter who they were, because I was usually the one who had to deliver the changes that Herd wanted made back to the committee. I got to the point where I didn't care if the guys on the committee were mad at me or not. I was just doing my job and getting it from both ends. Herd would storm into my office, throwing the format onto my desk and saying, "Who wrote this? What the hell is this shit?" "Well, that would be Saturday's show," I'd reply. "What's not going on this way?" he'd say. And I knew that I was going to have to bring his changes back to the booking committee. They were pissed when Herd changed stuff, and Herd was pissed at the committee's approach. I was the office guy in the middle. Generally, Herd thought there was too much talking, too many interviews. His experiences was from directing some episodes of Sam Murdoch's long-tenured promotion in St. Louis. That promotion had heavily emphasized matches with few interviews. That made St. Louis the exception. To Herd, however, that was how wrestling should be. But those on the committee all knew that a lot of times the interviews were better than the matches. We also knew that the interviews were vital to selling tickets and pay-per-view events, as well as getting across the wrestlers' personalities. Our roster had some of the best talkers ever, and an interview with Terry Funk or Jim Cornette was going to be more entertaining than the one-sided squash matches that were the norm on TV. I knew all of this. I knew the booking committee knew all of this. I knew Herd didn't know this, and I knew that I would still bring the changes back and get shit for it. Then bring the new format to Herd and get shit for that too. My take was, if you're going to work with somebody on a daily basis, you have to coexist in some sort of professional, amicable, tolerable manner. If you're in a contentious relationship, no matter if it's personal or professional, it's not good. It's not good for your health. It's not good for anything. So I tried to get along with her the best I could. I knew he didn't have a lot of product knowledge, but I also saw a booking committee that had their own agendas as well. From the get-go, WCW had problems that were so obvious that they could have easily been fixed, and one of the senior VPs or executive directors made WCW a priority. I began to think, somebody's going to see some of these things that I'm seeing. But as the days and weeks and months went by, they didn't. What they did was, they applied to WCW what they thought worked for TBS. They turned the decision-making over to a committee. TBS was just setting us up to fail on a creative level. I knew you couldn't put active performers on a booking committee. You'd never get any long-term planning done if everybody in power had a dog in the hunt. People just looked out for themselves, and it stopped us from going down creative avenues we should have been going down, like pulling the trigger on Sting. I tried to tell Flair that he was so big and so over that he didn't need the world title to be a really significant asset. When I voiced that same opinion at the booking committee meetings, I caught flack from some of the others who wanted Rick to be happy. I even had my words twisted around to the point that I had guys asking me why I thought it didn't matter who the world champ was. My thoughts were simple. Rick was better than the title. He had spent most of the last decade as heavyweight champion of the world. Flair would still appeal to fans as long as he was featured and put into a personal issue where he could cut a passionate promo about it and then be made whole by the end of it. It was best for WCW to have two major drawing cards in Ric Flair, plus Sting as the world champion, and Flair wouldn't have been hurt either creatively or financially, as he wasn't getting paid extra for being the champion. But I knew Flair looked at the creative end just like he viewed being the traveling NWA champion. As Booker, he was the one responsible for the attendance, the TV ratings, the casting, and the storytelling. He wasn't going to get grades to let him know how he was doing. Keeping business strong was how he was going to be judged. He certainly wasn't going to get fired, but if business dropped while he was booking, he would have been known, at least in his own head, as a failed booker. That led him to the decision that a lot of bookers had made over the years. He could depend on himself more than he could anybody else. So he filled out a roster with people he felt he could rely on. His buddies. He was doing them a solid, getting them good bookings on the card, and they would then have his back in political situations. Sting would have to wait. Chapter 29. Rotating Announcers. 1989. I got my meeting with Hurd and his boss Jack Petrick. I wanted to talk money, and they wanted to talk about my role in the company. When I entered the office, Tony Schiavone was already sitting opposite Hurd and Petrick, with an empty seat waiting for me. Tony and I heard through the grapevine, telephone, telegram, telewrestler, that the meeting was coming, so I wanted to be prepared. I found out the salaries of the announcers who called Turner's Atlanta Braves baseball games. Tony also told me his best year was at $20,000. I sat down and kind of took over. I didn't even mean to, but I was that passionate about what we did as the voices of the show that I memorized ratings of the show we did, the hours we worked, and the miles we traveled compared to other announcers in the Turner corporate family. We outworked them all, but we were getting paid far less. Plus, we had no off season. Hurd and Petrick listened and nodded along as I made a case for Tony and me to get a bump in salary. When we were done, or when I was done, Hurd and Petrick asked me to step outside while they spoke to Tony. Can you give us 20 minutes with Tony? Hurd asked. Of course, no problem, I replied. As I closed the door, leaving the other three men in the office, I thought I was finished. It was the classic wrestling paranoia kicking in again. Maybe my mouth got the better of me, and Tony, who stayed more or less silent during the meeting, was the kind person they wanted on board. I took a walk around the floor, and on my way back to Herd's office, I saw Tony at the payphone, and he had a smile from ear to ear. He gave me the thumbs up as I passed. I knocked on Herd's door and entered to see Petrick was still there too. Herd got straight to the point. Jim, we want to offer you a 50% raise and make it a 3-year deal. Now I knew why Tony was smiling so much. Yes, sir, I said. We have a deal? Petrick asked. I put out my hand to shake on it. We have a deal, I replied. As it turned out, our meeting to discuss money was only the first of 2 meetings that Herd and Petrick wanted to have with Tony and me. The second meeting was about where the company saw us plying our trade. Once again, I found myself sitting opposite Jim Herd and Jack Petrick, with Tony Schiavone beside me. The brass has decided that one of you is going to be the voice of syndication, and the other is going to be the voice of TBS, Herd said. Now they decided that it's going to be you, Tony, on syndication, while Jim here goes on TBS. I immediately knew that Tony was not happy with coming off of TBS after nearly 4 years of hosting that show and losing that national exposure. The syndicated world still offered a lot of exposure, but doing it market by market was a slog instead of doing overlay. I said, well, look, it doesn't matter. I'll be happy with syndication and Tony can do TBS. You both got the same contract, the same money, Herd said. It's the same work for the same pay, just in different directions. Now we got a list of so many pictures that they're showing us here. Let me show you. I'm going to show you the pictures they got here in this book. Got this one right here. This one right here. Yeah, this one right here. St. Pete, Florida in 1976. Beginning our journeys at Bill Kinnaman's MLB umpire school, with MLB umpiring legend Tim McClelland and college baseball's Tony Gisondi. I'm using my wrestling face, photo courtesy of the author. Mid-South days in the first tux I ever owned. Cowboy facilitated it from his pal Ed Bashara's men's store in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Photo courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Very, very proud of my work of being noticed. Photo of George Napolitano. Yeah. We're looking into the pictures now that he's not here. Right here, where my finger is pointing at. Dr. Death was number 76 for the OU Sooners on the Meridian, but he was number 1 in many hearts, including mine. He was $2 steak tough. Photo, Dr. Mike Lano, Rialano at AOL.com. Right here, my mentor, Cowboy Bill Watts, who was a pro wrestling genius and a man who redefined the term tough love. Photo, George Napolitano. Right. right here. The Stingler and Gentleman Chris Adams verbalizing their case of why fans need to buy a ticket to see them perform. Right here. Was there ever a better three-man team than the Fabulous Freebirds led by the talented Michael P.S. Hayes? Photo, Dr. Mike Lano. Same email address that we said earlier, but we're moving on. Let's see here, right here. The greatest to ever do it. The Mage. Rick's passion to be the best separated him from his peers. Right here. Let's see that. This one. Dusty Rhodes' charisma, the it factor, could be defined by his attire at this televised event on which we teamed. Did I borrow my black hat gimmick from the Dream? Good question, Jim. Right here, Hall of Fame level talents Mark Calloway, aka The Undertaker, Teddy Long, and Dangerous Dan Spivey in WCW. Some in WCW thought Calloway would never make it. Now that's Pet-Coon Goofy. Photo courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. If you don't know who The Undertaker is, you're not a fan of wrestling. Or you just don't know about wrestling in general, because his name is very synonymous. The Undertaker, aka Mark Calloway, particularly as The Undertaker, is synonymous in the world of wrestling. Next we have this picture. New set for WCW Saturday Night, the flagship show, the flagship broadcast for years on Ted Turner's TBS. Right here, custom made suit thanks to Uncle Ted. Broadcasting on TBS on Saturdays at 6:05 p.m. Eastern was awesome for this fan. Photos courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Right here. The Dream and me doing pay-per-view work. Rhodes loved to invent new words on live TV, if you will. Photo, Dr. Mike Lano. Jesse the Body Ventura was amazingly talented, but our team never accomplished what we should have due to my ego. Sorry, Governor. Photos courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Down here at the very bottom. Tony Schiavone was one of my favorite broadcast partners in my career and is now producing UGA Bulldog football and basketball games, as well as being the voice of the Gwinnett Braves and hosting a successful podcast. Photo courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Right here, my wrestling broadcast role model, the best to ever man, a Mike, my wrestling broadcast role model, the best to ever man a Mike, Gordon Sully. Photo, George Napolitano. Quite the dangerous duo, the Barbarian and Mrs. Foley's baby boy, Mick. Lots of top talent passed through WCW. Photo, George Napolitano. Yeah, we're almost done with the pictures, don't worry. This one. Dusty Rhodes, Jim Crockett, and me at a breakfast meeting where the Dream was holding court. Looks like we were coming off a long night. Photo, George Napolitano. Jerry the King Lawler and I seemed to gel from day one. We strive to get better with every outing. Jerry was the star of our team without a doubt. Photo courtesy of the author. I thankfully no longer smoke. He said, look at this picture. He's got a cigarette in his hand, right? You can just barely see it, but there's a cigarette right there in his hand. But he says, I thankfully no longer smoke. Jock Watts and me during our days broadcasting for Joel's stepfather, Cowboy Bill Watts of Mid-South Wrestling. Joel was a brilliant video editor. Photos courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Steve Borden, aka Sting, is one of my longest standing friends in the wrestling biz. Always charismatic, athletic, and exuding integrity in class. This pick was taken at Oklahomania in 2016. Well, not all creative concepts are hits. Yeah, look at that. Photos courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. My first WrestleMania in 1993 with Bobby the Brain Heenan and Macho Man Randy Savage being Savage outdoors at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. The start of an amazing journey. Photo courtesy of the author. Attitude Era attire, complete with the 2200X Resistol hat, which was a Christmas gift from Steve Austin. Photo courtesy of the author. Photo by Dr. Mike Lano. Look at that. That was when he would appear on WWE shows. When he would come out, they would, before the show started, they would announce, they would give you the announcers, the commentators for the night. Yeah. They would do that before the show starts. I would know this because I've been at a few WWE shows to know how they do this. Nothing beats him and my Boomer Sooner entrance music at a WWE event and the fans responding in kind. That live feeling cannot be replaced. Photo courtesy of the author. Right here. Can't explain what these two Hall of Famers, J.J. Dillon and Jerry Briscoe, have meant to me, both personally and professionally in my career. Photo, Dr. Mike Lano. My career has been blessed with many outstanding broadcast partners, including these two who I met working first for Jim Crockett Promotions. The great Bob Candle and the talented Tony Schiavone. Bob is the classiest pro I ever met in the biz. Photo courtesy of the author. I think this is our last page here. Nope, we got one more after this one. Happy days with our WWE family, including the young Dwayne Johnson, Bruce Pritchard, aka Brother Love, Olympian Mark Henry, and my late wife Jan, who was my secret weapon in talent relations. With your Olympic hero with your Olympic hero in England, Pittsburgh's own Kurt Angle was one of our all-time great signees. No amateur great ever made a smoother and impactful transition to the pros. Stone Cold Steve Austin and yours truly with a lovely Oklahoma Sooners football fan at the OU game in Norman. Photos courtesy of the author. All three of those. More recognition, this time from Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Photo courtesy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Enjoying my Sooners winning the Big 12 championship in Arlington, Texas against Nebraska before politics and egos played the lead. Photo courtesy of the author. And of course, I don't think that a woman could love her man more than my angel Jan loved me. Miss you terribly. Photo, Dr. Mike Lano. I tried again. It doesn't matter to me. So, well, let's do a little bit of a flashback. In case you forgot, because I was showing all those pictures, Jim Ross is being set to commentate on TBS Live, while Tony Schiavone is set to run syndication shows as commentator for the. And he's supposed to be a commentary for syndicated shows, but Jim Ross will be doing live commentary. So I tried again. It doesn't matter to me. Hurd said, "It's not up for discussion or debate. This is the way it's going to be." It was tough to see Tony hurt. He and I grew close during the TBS post-production work for Crockett in Atlanta, earning just $35 a day each. As a way of saving money, we shared a room in his car. We were ecstatic when they built a new Fairfield Inn at the Atlanta airport because uh, the standard room had two double beds, and because it also had remote control TV. We didn't even fight over the remote. It was just the general theory that being able to lay in bed and change channels was just too good to be true. Now we found ourselves on opposite sides of a situation that neither of us wanted. We could both see that Hurt and Patrick were done. Meeting was over. There was nothing left to say. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that Tony had taken an offer to go work for WWF for even more money. Well, here's how I see this, okay? I don't think. Wait, where's my. Oh, there it is. I was doing this just to make sure nothing was going to happen. But anyway, yeah, I don't blame Jim Ross here on this one because he was trying to stick up for his part for a fellow colleague, but the head honchos, the powers that be, did not want to hear it, and that's fucked up, if you ask me. Rotating announcers wasn't a new concept in wrestling. Freshening up the voices was routinely one of the first things a new boss or booker might try to make their mark on a show. Wrestling was a business of newness. New champions, new matches, new markets, new announcers. Just like when I brought a voice in the past to put back to TV. Gordon Sully was a role model for me as an announcer. Bill Watts did a lot of business with Eddie Graham, Sully's mentor, so we would get tapes from Florida where I heard a lot of Gordon's work. Even before I got into the business, I heard Gordon call the Danny Hodge Matsuda title change 100 times. His voice was etched in my mind as the greatest announcer in wrestling history. But he got forced out of TBS in 1985 when Jim Crockett took over and wanted Tony Schiavone and Jimmy's brother, David Crockett, to be the voices of his national wrestling show. Gordon's treatment was an issue, and Crockett felt it was time for something new. Unfortunately, Gordon got unceremoniously pushed out. I thought that someone who had given this many years, been that loyal, and worked so diligently to bring some class and decorum to the show deserved better. So we created a role for Gordon in WCW. He was kind of like a Walter Cronkite commentator. We called him the Dean of Wrestling Broadcasters. He liked hearing everyone use this new moniker, and soon it was, "Here comes the Dean," and "Good morning, Dean." So we created a deal where we would write 2 minutes of commentary, an idea I got from Paul Harvey, an iconic radio newsman who did, and now, the rest of the story. So Gordon would basically give you his thoughts on an angle. We would write it, and Gordon would edit it if he chose to, giving him editorial control. We put in the prompter, and away the Dean went. Gordon lived in Tampa, so we'd fly on Delta, and because he was a million miler, he always flew first class. Of course, in first class, you drink free, and he was a lifetime member of the Crown Room, which meant he also drank free at the airport. At about midday on his first day in, Gordon was due to arrive at the CNN Center to meet me and go over his segments. By the time he arrived, I think it was fair to say that he'd been a little too much to drink. He'd had a little too much to drink. He'd been overserved, as he liked to say. Keith Mitchell, who was the head of production, called me and said, "You need to come down here. We have a problem with Gordy." I replied, "Okay, I'll be right down." I was on the 12th floor, so I rushed to an elevator, went down, and immediately saw my friend was a little more than overserved. "Gordon," I said, "the storyline's changed and the bookers are working on the new direction upstairs." "What?" he said. His speech was slurred, his eyes watery and somewhat glazed over. I don't want you to have to do it 2 or 3 times," I said. "If it's all right, why don't you just spend the night and we'll do it in the morning?" I didn't want to scold a man I greatly respected or embarrass him on his first day on the new job. Instead, I checked him into the Omni Hotel while he disappeared into the bar. We rolled tape at 9 a.m. the next morning, and he was just fine. So from then on, that's what we did. Gordon flew in late evening, just in time for him to get a nice dinner and a beverage, and then we'd get up first thing in the morning and nail down his segment. It was good to see him back, and his appearance always got great feedback. The fans loved having him be part of a TBS wrestling show once more. Gordon had an issue with the booze. It wasn't a well-kept secret. His health was deteriorating, and unfortunately, his best friend and his life partner, his wife Smokey, was very ill too. Watching her fade away was killing him. I wanted to do something to say thank you for steering me in the right direction. Thank you for steering me in this direction. I wanted to give the best in the business a reason to put on a suit and come in from a camera again. For many, many wrestling fans, he was a voice of their childhood, and to hear him back on the air, even for 2 minutes a show, was a pleasure. A short time later, we were doing WTBS Saturday Night Show tapings, and I was lacking a color man. Gordon, yeah, when he says color man, he's referring to a color commentator. Shut up. Gordon, I'm saying that to anybody that's going to try to spin that in a racist way. Gordon was very, very apprehensive about doing color because, to be truthful, he didn't want to go 4+ hours without a drink. I sent a stagehand out to grab an igloo cooler, and we filled it partly with orange juice and the rest with the vodka. Gordon sat beside me all night and drank screwdrivers for 4 hours and just filled in the blanks. Drink or no drink, I loved working with him. It made me feel like I did something right for the business, that he got to come back and step out of the dugout for one last run and rip his hat to the crowd. Hey, I did not say to start a video. What the hell is wrong with you? Fucking TV. Chapter 30. Steamboat and Flair, 1989. I was excited when I learned that Ricky the Dragon Steamboat was coming in. George Scott had pushed for Ricky hard in his short stint as booker. He knew, as we all did, that Steamboat could help us a lot because he still had it. Sometimes when guys step away, you don't know if it's a lingering issue, physically, or they can't hold up as they once could. But one look at Steamboat, and it was easy to see that he was healthy and motivated. I had never called any of his matches before, but I had seen him on tape numerous times. During his classics with Flair for the title, I could tell he hadn't lost a step. Smooth as silk at times, almost too smooth. He was really, really talented and always gave the audience superb match quality. His one with Flair was bringing out the best in both Flair as champion, in both Rick as champion and Ricky as challenger. At Chi-Town Rumble, we flipped both men's roles as Steamboat pinned Flair in an amazing match in Chicago. We knew switching the belt would only help prolong the feud, where everyone would benefit. Of course, we as the booking committee didn't do Steamboat any favors, creatively, by putting his wife and son with him in the storyline. His wife really wanted it to happen, but I didn't want Flair to do it. The ultimate family man with his wife and little boy versus Ric Flair, the king of adultery and dalliances and Learjets, and diamond rings and limos. Normally having both guys so polar opposite, one with family values and the other real, the other materialistic and arrogant, would be a great idea, but we were heading into a time of defiance in our audiences. Bringing your wife and your little boy to the ring was hard for some young males to swallow. If they were going to live vicariously through somebody, it seemed they wanted it to be the jet-flying, limousine-riding son of a gun. Whatever about the creative surrounding both men, when the matches started, it was poetry in motion. Absolutely spectacular. Steamboat was as good as the seller in the ring as anybody I ever saw. He made me wonder, several times during commentary, if he was really hurt. And I knew if I was genuinely and authentically concerned about his welfare, and if that rang true in my voice, then the fans watching at home would get even more involved in the story. I made a point of talking to Ricky shortly after he arrived, as part of the diligence, to find out some biographical information to make sure it was accurate. I wanted to know about his amateur wrestling background. Was he really trained by Vern Gagne? Was it really that daunting? Things like that. As far as what he was going to do during the match, or how he was going to get heat, I didn't care about that. As a broadcaster, I knew I had great storytellers in there, and I couldn't wait to help them tell their story. I didn't want to be affected with too much knowledge. I wanted to get on the same ride that the audience was on, except I'm going to be voicing it over as we ride along together. Just as Flair and Steamboat were always looking to change their dynamics, it seemed change was part of my job too. For Clash of Champions 6, I was joined by the announcer's booth by none other than NWA legend and finest and first time announcer Terry Funk. Terry was always great on the mic, but taking in the details and direction of announcing sometimes caught even the best promo guys off guard. But not the Funker. Within minutes I was pleasantly surprised at how good Terry was. A lot of wrestlers that got the chance to do color commentary are more concerned about putting themselves over or memorizing specific lines. It's like hearing the guys talking about putting their matches together. Well, I need to get my shit in, and knowing that's what the match turns out to be. Shit. Before he arrived, I had no idea what to expect from Terry. He showed up nicely dressed, even though it was counter to his crazy Texan persona. That little detail alone led me to believe that Terry wasn't going to get himself over, but to get the matches over and the pomp and circumstance of a big event over. In wrestling matches, the heel usually calls the match. In wrestling commentary, it's the play-by-play guy in the lead who calls the match. Terry had the great ability, no different than he would have in the ring, to listen to what I did and come right with me. To go out and do a live 2-hour broadcast is challenging for the most experienced broadcasters, much less someone that's new at it. But Funk was a natural. His instincts took over. His understanding of the fundamentals of the game took over. His passion for his business took over. Terry offered the perspective of a former world champion in terms of how a world champion carries out his strategy to keep the title. He was always a great in-ring psychologist, and that mindset and skill set was invaluable to him in his role as an announcer that night. We gelled well and added the lyrics to the music that Flair and Steamboat were providing in the ring. Terry Funk was another pro wrestling treasure who quickly became one of my favorite TV partners. My partners were always changing, but I was happy to use my experience and confidence in what I was doing to try and add as best I could to every event we were putting out there. Calling all the matches, I felt like we had a better in-ring product than WWF. But sitting on the booking committee, I also knew just how fragile our shot at becoming number one truly was. Alright. Okay. Chapter 31. Starcade. 1989. I was so stoned that I couldn't command my own hands to function. That's a lot of stoned. But I was legally stoned. Or so I thought. I was on my way to Starcade Future Shock, but had just been through another dental ordeal. My fourth bridge in a month, and I needed a clear head. Nitrous oxide and in-house pain pills weren't a good mix, but I thought nothing more of it as I got a cab back to my CNN Center office. I sat at my desk and waited for the effects of the dental visit to wear off. I had paid the dentist $10,000 up front on my first visit, whilst also under the effects of nitrous oxide to get that perfect TV smile. I was finally at the end of 3 root canals and 4 bridges and ready for my close-up, except I couldn't stop dribbling on myself. The effects of the gas and pills were starting to subside, but the numbing agent was still in full effect. My office phone rang, and the receptionist downstairs said there was someone here to see me. Got any food and off for an hour, please? I said. What? She replied. Can you flute? What? Is this a bad line? Kylie! I'll send him in. Thanks. Click. Foot's sake, I said as I hung up the phone. I didn't want anyone to see me like this. I was a bumbling, sloppy mess. So I did what any grown, rational man would do. I ducked out of my office to hide. I was sure whoever it was could wait, or find me later at the venue. I just wasn't in the mood or space to talk wrestling, or talk in general. I walked around. I walked around for 20 minutes with a sheet of paper in my hand to make people think I was too busy to stop. I presumed whoever was looking for me would surely now be gone, but when I returned to my office, I could see a very serious-looking gentleman waiting outside for me. Are you James Ross? He asked as I approached. I still wasn't sure of my speech, so I nodded. He introduced himself as a DEA agent. Can I come in? He asked. DEA? I could immediately tell this wasn't a rib. I didn't want him in my office, but I also didn't want anyone in the corporate company seeing someone from the Drug Enforcement Agency questioning me either. Again I nodded and we entered my office. I took a seat behind my desk and prayed to the good Lord in the sky that my tongue and speech had returned to their normal selves before I spoke to the Drug Enforcement Agency. He took out a small pen and pad and pen. Did you have some dental work done today? He asked. I knew I had to answer, but I didn't know what my answer would sound like. Yes, I quickly replied. My reply sounded good, but it was too short to tell if I was 100%. I had no idea where he was going, but his general demeanor was intimidating. He watched me closely and leaned forward. And did you get any prescriptions made out in your name today? Yes, I said. I was kind of sure my speech was okay, but not sure enough that I wanted to try to make full sentences if I didn't have to. If this guy was suspicious of me for some reason, dribbling all over myself while slurring my words was going to make things a whole lot worse. It seems that there have been a lot of prescriptions made out in your name over a very short period of time, he said. And then it hit me. My dentist was very pill-friendly, and I did get a lot of prescriptions from him over a 4-week period. Luckily for me, I didn't fill any of the prescriptions past the very first one. In my drawer, I had what some people in the wrestling business might call an Aladdin's cave of scripts. It gave me access to high-caliber painkillers. But I was never that guy, so there the uncashed prescriptions lay, waiting to bail me out of a potentially sticky situation. Let me slow you these, I said. Slow? He asked. Show, I replied as I corrected my tongue and took out the prescriptions. I could explain everything. The agent was astonished that I had all the scripts in my top desk drawer and that I was never going to fill them. How are you dealing with all the pain from your dental work? He asked. Crown Royal, I replied, shrugging my new $10,000 smile. He wasn't one bit impressed. Our meeting lasted 30 minutes, or 25 minutes more than necessary. The script happy dentist was next on his list. Starcade was next on mine. I came up with the round robin concept that some people in the back loved, and others not so much. We were looking for a different theme for the upcoming pay-per-view, and everybody was pitching new ideas for the booking meeting. We wanted a kind of sports-oriented theme to stick with our more sports-geared presentation. The idea of the round robin itself posed political issues because some guys didn't want to lose, and others simply didn't understand it. I got the sense backstage that it probably caused too many political issues to be fully embraced by the talent. When I heard the guys putting their matches together and arguing over the finishes, I couldn't help but feel like I should have kept my mouth shut and let someone else come up with another idea. But unfortunately, nobody else had any good suggestions, even though management asked us to come up with something completely different. The brass wanted a concept pay-per-view. So I came up with baby faces versus baby faces and heel versus heels, all in the spirit of athletic competition and new matches. As a wrestling fan, I was intrigued by the Road Warriors versus the Steiners. My rationale was it was a new concept, something different for that pay-per-view, and we were coming to the end of the NFL season, so everyone was talking football. So I thought it would be kind of cool to give us some matchups that we had not seen in the tournament setting that meant something. I thought the concept of a tournament that began and ended on the same night it began gave you a payoff for the investment of the pay-per-view dollar was a logical idea. But the idea wasn't a good one. The talent didn't buy it, and the rest of the booking committee didn't spend any time trying to sell it to them. There were too many political agendas, too many people playing favorites for it to have any real impact. At least I had a great smile to help me convince people that I didn't want to scream and pull my damn hair out. Now, this actually goes by quicker than I realized. Hmm. Chapter 32. Some Old Faces Return. 1990. Change was in the air. It nearly always was in WCW. The booking decisions and playing favorites was starting to catch up to the house show business, which was in the toilet. Word was that Hurd wanted Flair out of the booker's role and that Rick's replacement was imminent. As I boarded my flight to the next town and the next show, I saw a familiar face looking back. Tony Schiavone. I had heard that his time at WWF wasn't the easiest, and moving his wife and 5 kids to the far more expensive Northeast was taking its toll. But I had no idea he was back in WCW until I saw him on the flight. I was happy to shake his hand and see him back. I think we all were. The new Booker, though, now he was a different proposition of people. Ole Anderson was a rough, no bullshit, no hand holding type of person. I was glad he was going to be the new Booker because at least there was now one guy that we could go to and get clarification on a question. His reply probably wasn't going to be the most genteel, businesslike corporate response, but you would know exactly where you stood. Like the old saying went, you can get the horse's head or the horse's ass. At least by going to Ole, you went to the horse's head. I knew I wouldn't always agree with his mythology or his style, or his presentation skills, but I never ever wouldn't appreciate and respect his knowledge of the business. I knew very quickly that he and I were on the very same page. He'd give me the broad brush strokes and expect me to be professional enough to connect the dots. He never once produced me in my headset, leaving that to Keith Mitchell, who was a joy to hear because he too let me do my job. My theory was simple. If somebody on the roster was better than me, then hell, put them in my spot. I knew that's what life is about. I enjoyed the competition, but I didn't need to be spoon-fed basic fundamental things. That's Wrestling 101. Ole was one of those guys who wanted you to feel it, and he wanted you to see what you call and call what you see. Have the ability, the talent to put it in the right tone and inflection on the air, and that's what I did. He was more concerned about the boys and the in-ring product than he was about the announcing. But that's because he was spoiled when it came to the announcing. He had Gordon Soley during his peak years and Bob Caudle in the Mid-Atlantic. Ole had the luxury of working with some really good storytellers that were low-maintenance guys, and I wanted that trend to continue. Ole came into the job frustrated and stayed that way because of the intrusions and the idiocies of TBS upper management who thought wrestling was so simplistic that any idiot could manage it, produce it, announce it, and perform it. The majority of the executives that had the stroke didn't understand why Ted had bought Jim Crockett to start with. And the deal was that most of the guys in the blue suits didn't have the balls to go to Ted and express their concerns. They just lashed out and were corporate bullies to those of us who worked in WCW. Ole would write the main TV shows and the secondary shows. Tony Schiavone and I would write. He then gave feedback and kept us in the loop as to what was coming up in the storylines, so that when we did go on the air, we were clued in as to where he was going. It was off air that was harder to see where it was heading. Excuse me. Chapter 33. Building Sting. 1990. Almost from the start, the eventual goal was for Flair to pass the torch to Sting and Sting be the babyface champion. Then the WCW creative would be in the process of building viable heels to chase the champion babyface, and then playing off what WWF had done with Hulk Hogan, Watts with JYD, and Eddie Graham with Dusty Rhodes. It was a simple philosophy. Some territories are heel territories, but you've got a heel champion in the babyface's chase, and some are the opposite. I wanted Sting to be our flag bearer, and for more heels to be created to chase him. But for that to happen, we first needed Flair to pass the torch. Then, during the main event of Clash of the Champions Texas Shootout, Sting blew out his patellar tendon trying to get in the steel cage. In the very same match where Flair had turned on him to start their feud. So, of our top two heroes, one had turned villain and the other got injured. It was a disaster, so we needed to turn Lex Luger back, even though he had been heated up as an arrogant villain. Luger wasn't cast in any one role long enough for people to get into a groove with about him they really felt groove about how they really felt about him. Pro wrestling wasn't Lex's natural calling because he didn't have an intense aptitude for it, so adapting to those multiple changes didn't come organically for him. With help in time, he improved on his promos, and while never being great, he was always good enough to get by because of how he looked. Having watched him closely for months, I thought he could have learned more, absorbed more, when he was with the Horsemen. There wasn't a better place in the wrestling world to be if you wanted to learn how to make money. Lex was with a perfect entity to just be quiet, to watch and learn. I had dealt with guys I enjoyed working with more. Luger was Luger was never rude to me, but I found him to be somewhat aloof and arrogant at times. He placed a very high value on his look, which is fine, as I understood that in the wrestling world you have to do that to maintain your sanity sometimes, but he just wasn't as advanced as he thought he was. He never met a mirror that he didn't embrace, and really, that was his big priority, the look. He thought the look was going to get him farther down the road than it actually did. It certainly got him noticed, and he always looked the part without question. But his in-ring skill set was not advanced to push him up to that next level. So with Sting out, Lex was put into the Capital Combat pay-per-view with Flair, while Sting appeared with an unusual guest in RoboCop. Fucking RoboCop? I asked backstage. Keith Mitchell just nodded. From the movie? Keith nodded again. We had no choice. Turner's home entertainment division kind of deal with the studio. What are they expecting us to do with RoboCop? I asked. We have to figure it out, Keith replied. Well, there wasn't much to figure it out. RoboCop was essentially useless. Not just as a character, but as a prop too. He couldn't do a run-in because he couldn't move faster than a snail in his costume. He couldn't walk up steps, so he couldn't get him in the ring, and he couldn't throw a punch or take any moves because the suit was so restrictive. So he had to come up with a wrestling angle for a guy in a full-body cast. The executives wanted us to be seen as Hollywood friendly, just like Vince was in WWF. During the introduction of Sting and RoboCop, our hero Sting was pushed into a cage by three of the Dastardly Four Horsemen, where he had to wait for RoboCop to shuffle down the aisle and rip off the cage door to free him. He gave us a plate of horse shit and we had to make it kinda edible, Ole said. RoboCop aside, Sting was ready to be champion. He wanted it, the fans wanted it, but others didn't. Ric Flair had a lot of allies. He was the best performer in the world, one of the top three I had ever seen. He was already a made man, a legendary figure, so with the title or not, he was going to be a huge part of the shows and a huge draw for the fans. Problem was, Flair saw himself as the champ. He didn't like the idea of not being associated with the big gold belt. Basically, he's being Shawn Michaels from the 1990s version of Shawn Michaels. Like the WCW version of the 90s version of Shawn Michaels. That's pretty much what we're doing here. It wasn't the first time that Rick had put the brakes on a potential new champion. A few months earlier, I had mentioned Japanese star the Great Muta as a possible future champion too. Rick was having none of it. Jim Herd curiously heard about my suggestion afterward, even though he wasn't even there, and simply said there was no way we could get people to cheer a Japanese guy. You know what? This makes me think of a story that I heard from Jim Cornette. Actually, see if I can find it. Hmm. See, I would have to try to find it, but I remember. Because I remember there was a video that. I can't remember whether it was in '89 or '90, but there was a there was a video that I seen on YouTube talking about Jim Cornette doing something with Brian Pillman. Um, I can't remember exactly. I don't remember where the video is, and I don't know if it's here now right now. But I can probably run it down for you real quickly. So what happened was, I think it was in 1990. Now that I think about it, and I don't know if Jim Ross will talk about it in the book because I don't know if we're there yet, or if we went past it from his story. But the story from Jim Cornette went. He had the idea during one of Ric Flair's numerous title runs as WCW champion, because of course he had to be the champion, whatever. Um, he was doing a thing with, there was an idea that Jim Cornette had, that Ric Flair was on board with, involving Brian Pillman. The story was the idea for the storyline that they had planned for him was how he would put it would be Brian Pillman feuding with the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette in a 3-on-1 situation, in a way that would get him over with the fans and put him in a title match with Ric Flair for the world title, and then Flair was possibly going to drop the belt to him. And Flair was all on board with that, by the way. Jim Cornette himself said so. Um, but anyway, so what happened was, well, that was according to Jim Cornette, I should say. But what happened was, so the storyline was going to go where they would have the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette feud with Brian Pillman. But what they would do is they would basically go after Brian Pillman's neck, because a backstory would tell you he had this sort of thing. I don't remember what Jim Cornette called it, what Jim Cornette said it was, but he had something that involved that that happened to his neck that caused him to require so many surgeries, and because of that, he would have this raspy voice, this sort of raspy voice where you could probably hear what he was saying, but not entirely, but you would still be able to hear what he was saying. You probably couldn't understand it, but it was still raspy voice. And so the storyline would go that at one point the the Midnight Express would go after Brian Pillman and basically target that neck that neck problem that he had, to the point to where he would not be able to speak, where he would just, like, you would just barely hear, like you could not even hear him, to the point to where he had to have like a mouthpiece with him until his voice got better in storyline. And then in the ultimate showdown, that would be the end of the feud, it was going to be Brian Pillman versus the Midnight Express in a 2-on-1 match. And if Pillman won that match, he would then have 5 minutes with Jim Cornette in the ring, and then they would go out of that deal and they would have him feud with Ric Flair. But remember, this was 1990, and you have heard of the stories from Jim Ross himself in regard to Jim Herd. So you heard Ross's side of the stories involving Herd. And Jim Herd acted like he knew what the wrestling business was all about, but he really didn't. He really did not know anything about the wrestling business, if we're being... Even the wrestling fans in 1990 knew more about the wrestling business than even Jim Herd. But whatever. Anyway, so Jim Herd was against that whole idea because, quote, he thought it would make Brian look weak. Referring to Pillman. Now, you guys heard what I just said the plan was. You guys tell me, especially the wrestling fans out there watching this, you guys tell me, did the storyline that I just said, do you guys think that would have made Brian Pillman weak? Because for my money, I don't think so. To me, it would make him look more like a sympathetic character than a weak one. Because you're having a wrestler having his injury, being attracted to by these wrestlers and their manager. And the crowd is going to be fully supporting him 100%. That is not a weak character. That is a sympathetic character. I mean, look at how many times they've tried this. You know, they have done this. They've even done this in WWE at times. They've done it they've done it with the likes of Jake the Snake Roberts and Eddie Guerrero with their personal problems that their respective addictions that they've had. They've tried it in a storyline with Kane and Triple H in what is regarded as the worst storyline WWE could have ever made. And no, we're not going to talk about it because it is very disgusting and disturbing on every fucking level. You've had the moments where you just had those type of moments. In this moment, I would not see Brian Pillman as weak. I would see him as sympathetic. That's my take on it. That's why I don't like Jim Herd's idea. I never even watched wrestling in 1990 because I wasn't born in 1990. That was before I was even born. By the time I was probably like old enough to, comprehend some things, it was 2000, 2001. So it was about the end of the Monday Night Wars as far as WCW and WWE went. Because in 1990, the Monday Night Wars wasn't even a thing. We'll get to that when we get to it. Anyway. A few months later, at the Great American Bash, Sting did get his victory over Flair. It was a huge moment that was again dick punched by events outside the Stinger's control. Bad booking, overly complex finishes, and no red-hot heel waiting to chase the new champion hurt Sting's ability to cement his place at the top of the card. As fellow booking committee member Kevin Sullivan said, "You never saw a knight become a knight by slaying a salamander. He's got to kill a big dragon to be a hero." But only had a master plan to bring Sting his dragon to slay, and that dragon's name was the Black Scorpion. Actually, he didn't have a master plan. He had a half a plan, and even that half of the plan was just a screw you to everyone. When the management said they wanted a big angle for their TV and pay-per-views, Ole decided to give them just that. He started an idea with no plan on how to finish it. "I can book what I want," he said. "But what's the plan?" I asked. "We'll figure it out when we get there." That sounds very much like Vince Russo. I swear to God. Flashback to 1997 when flashback to Jim Cornette talking about something in 1990. Yeah, we're going back to Jim Cornette here for a moment because I do remember some of his stories. And he was talking about oh god, that fucking creepypasta. But anyway, Jim Cornette would always talk about how Vince Russo didn't really know much about the business. Like, he acted like he knew things about the business. Like, he was a wrestling fan, but he didn't know about certain things and such. Here, we're also dealing with the fact when he was talking about when Jim Cornette was talking about the build up between Kane and The Undertaker and the big build up to the WrestleMania match in 1998, from going from Kane's debut in October of 97 to the match with The Undertaker and Kane at WrestleMania in 1998. Here's what was going on, okay? In Jim Cornette's mind, he was thinking the best way to build these two up was to make it to where they didn't have a wrestling match, but they did have some sort of confrontation. But they would also have it to where Kane would not be willing, or not Kane, The Undertaker would not be willing to face his brother for a certain amount of time, up until what happened at the Royal Rumble. And then Undertaker would come back in February or March, and then he would say, what you pulled at the Royal Rumble has pissed me off so much that I had to go to our parents, this wasn't storyline by the way, and tell them that I would have to do the one thing I promised never to do, and that is basically fight you at WrestleMania, and I'm going to do it at WrestleMania. And I remember that promo so well, one of the best Undertaker promos ever. He even ends it in the best way possible. Kane, I want to give you a thought between now and WrestleMania, March 29th. I remember when we would fight when we were small children. Mother and father were always there to pull me off of you. But this time, there will be no one to save you. May the hounds of hell eat your rotting soul, and you will rest in peace. That was how that promo ended. But Vince Russo, on the other hand, wanted on the next week to have The Undertaker chokeslam Kane through a fucking table. Now you tell me, which is more exciting? A man getting his revenge 1 week after the fact, or this good long build-up to a match that I don't know is good or bad because it's been a while since I last seen it, but at least have a damn good build-up. I don't know about you, but I'd go for the slow build-up to a great match, to a possibly good match at WrestleMania. I'd rather have that happen than a fucking revenge story 1 week later. Because then it makes it redundant. That made that whole debut redundant, complete, utter shite. It just not worth wouldn't have been worth the debut of a brother and all that build up to him. If you ask me. Getting back to the story. At that point, Ole wasn't getting along with anyone and kind of isolated himself from outside points of view. In trying to block out the bad advice of the upper management, he simply blocked out all advice. Black Scorpion was going ahead whether there was an end for it or not, and Ric Flair was coming with him. Flair, of course, hated the idea. The Black Scorpion was some masked, mysterious man from Sting's past who sounded like Ole, because Ole did his voiceover on TV. He was also a different height and weight every time he was seen because he was being played under the mask by different wrestlers. Flair hated it so much that he refused to have anything to do with it. right up until the last messy seconds. Only was an old school do what I say booker, and at the back of it all, Flair was an old school team player. The Nature Boy was like any performer or athlete, was anxious about doing something so out of his comfort zone that a little guidance or coaching might have made all the difference. When the Nature Boy finally pulled off the mask to reveal himself as the Black Scorpion, he made the very best of a bad situation, but also talked about quitting. Again. Chapter 34. Lady on a Plane, 1990. I introduced you to her, Jimbo, Flair said. We were about to board another plane to hit another town. Of course I knew just who her was. Nothing lit up Flair's memory of Jan quite like a U.S. Airways flight. How long did she last? He asked as he sat down in his first class seat. We're moving in together, I said as I sat down beside him. He was shocked. What? Is she crazy? She must be. I thought the same. A few years before, Rick and I boarded a U.S. Airways flight from West Virginia to Atlanta. It was only a small flight with just 4 first-class seats. Nature Boy and I were the only passengers that sat in 2 of the 4 available. I'm really sorry, said the first-class attendant. They told us there weren't any first-class passengers on this flight, so there's no breakfast to serve. Is there vodka and orange juice? Flair asked. Yes, she replied. Then there's breakfast, sweetheart, Rick said. And bring a Bailey's and coffee for my friend. I smiled at her with my $10,000 TV smile, and she smiled back. Rick immediately leaned into her line of sight. Could you also hit up my $20,000 robe? 'Cause I'm the world's heavyweight champion. Jan took the robe and disappeared to make the drinks. For the next 30 minutes, the Nature Boy wheeled out his best lines to try and catch her attention. You want me to put on the robe for you, honey? Flair asked. I'm thinking immediately of a story that at this point of the live stream, nobody was there to hear. But it was so R-rated that I'm definitely making this book rated R. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. This book is definitely getting an R rating for so many things, but that scene specifically as well. I'm not even gonna discuss it. If you want to see it, you'll have to look back. I'm not discussing it here. I'm not discussing it here at all. Luckily, she refused, as I knew that put on the robe meant just the robe. I had already seen Flair's private parts way too many times. Thankfully, she stuck to her job, kept the drinks coming, and generally faded into the background. But I couldn't help notice how beautiful she was, and what a great sense of humor she had, as she told us some great jokes. When we landed, I read in my business card. Is that for her? Rick asked. Yeah, I replied. He burst into laughter. You really think she's going to go for you when she's been showing no interest in me? I put my card back in my pocket. Maybe he was right. Thank you guys for flying with us today. Hope you have a great day, Jan said as she handed Rick back his robe. Nate gathered together his things and walked out toward the door. Can I mumbled as I searched for my card again. I couldn't find my card. She had her own business card waiting for me. Is it okay to call you sometime? I asked. My number is there, she replied. It was because of that meeting on that flight that Ric Flair claimed he set Jan and me up on a date. And now you're moving in with the flight attendant that gave you her card, Jimbo? Flair asked. Yep, I replied. Rick could sense I was a little wary. He ordered some drinks. Not to celebrate, just because he wanted to drink. You ready to be tied down again? He asked as he held up his glass to toast. I clinked my drink off his, not knowing how to answer. I knew I loved Jan and didn't want to lose her. I also knew what a horrible husband I had been in the past. I'm not sure, I replied. I knew my dilemma didn't really affect Rick. To the Nature Boy, his wives were married, but he wasn't. So he basically an asshole. Okay. That's really an asshole way of thinking. My wives are married, but I'm not. It's kind of a cheater's way of thinking, dude. Seriously. That really is a cheater's way of thinking. And he is considered one of the great... He may be a great wrestler, but he sounds to be a bit of a terrible person at times. And maybe he had his good moments later in his... Like, in some later parts of his life. But early years, I don't see it. Chapter 35. Heyman, 1990. Paul Heyman was an ambitious, aggressive, in-your-face, never back down, pain in the ass, and I liked him immensely for it. I knew he was messy. Messed up the word. I knew he was money because he was born here with the guys in the business hating him nearly as much as the audience watching the show. He didn't genuflect for no one, and always called bullshit on the segments, people, or interviews he thought were bullshit. He hadn't been long fired from WCW, filed a lawsuit, and even met Vince about going to WWF. But I wanted him back. Unfortunately, I was surrounded by the people who despised the New York Jew so much that they simply didn't want him around, no matter his value to the company. That's kind of bullshit there, thinking that. But what if we brought him back and then beat the shit out of him on air? Jim Barnett asked. That would shut his mouth. Heyman once described Barnett to me as a flamboyant, evil son of a bitch, a cross between Truman Capote and Darth Vader. So that might have had something to do with Barnett's plan. I'll take him, I said. He can come with me and I'll be responsible for him. The small cabal who were trying to figure out Heyman's next step all shrugged their shoulders. As long as they didn't have to deal with him, they were fine with my suggestion. Just keep him away from us, was the general consensus. I called Heyman and said, I know you haven't signed a deal with Vince yet, and I want you back here. About 6 months before, Flair sent Heyman home for being a pain in the ass, but WCW wouldn't release Paul for the remainder of his contract. This left Heyman in quite a spot, as he couldn't come back to WCW because Flair wouldn't have it, and he couldn't go to WWF because he was still under contract. Paul felt he had no other recourse but to sue Turner and WCW. Jim, Heyman said to me over the phone, I'm not going back there. They haven't paid me in 6 months, and Ric Flair will make my life hell. I can't get you back as an announcer, I said. They hate you too much to put you front and center just yet. But I can get you back as a manager. I'm not interested. But if I was, who would I be managing? Mark Calloway? Oh, he's money. He sure is, I said. Me and Mark had already debuted with Teddy Long, both men had zero chemistry, and only was looking at the big red-headed Texan as a write-off. How fitting that both Paul Heyman and Jim Ross both said that Mark Calloway, who months later in 1990 would appear in WWE as The Undertaker, they both said he was money, but WCW as a whole wrote him off. I accidentally the books over here. I accidentally knocked these books over trying to do this. I was going to say, well, look who's laughing now. Look who got the last laugh there. The Undertaker sure as hell did. Because WCW, because The Undertaker lasted so much longer than WCW did after he debuted. Because they would last another, because when he debuted, WCW would last another 11 years, while The Undertaker, while Mark Calloway, aka The Undertaker, would be in the wrestling business for 30 plus years. Nowadays, he is more of a special appearance kind of person, but he is basically appearing mainly as the biker gimmick Undertaker, instead of the even when that bell gongs, he will still appear as Biker Taker over Dead Man Taker, because now, since he has hung up his boots and has retired, he can now be himself pretty much, which I think is a good idea because the character has a long-lasting legacy that can never be rivaled in any way, shape, or form, and now he can just be himself without any kind of repercussions. I think that is a great idea for him. Getting back to the story, I could sense that Paul was tempted. What if I worked something out that got you paid your 6 months that they owe you? What about Flair? He asked. If you don't pick a fight, I've got your back. I could hear some shuffling down the phone line. What do you say? I asked. You come back now, do your 6 months on your contract, and then if you want to leave WCW, you'll be doing it with a clean slate. So when WWF is done with you, you can come back here. Okay, he said. You're in? I asked. I'll see you tomorrow. Paul, before you hang up. Yeah? How's your driving license? It's clean. Good. Why? No reason. Pick me up at my house tomorrow. From there he drove me everywhere, and during those rides I passed on to him what had been passed on to me. All the lessons I learned from Watts, Ack, and Hodge. All the stories, Island psychology. Every chance I got, I'd bring him in on commentary with me as a guest. Our chemistry was undeniable. We would say the worst things to and about each other, but we always kept our eye on why we were doing that. We wanted to pull the audience in, and then use our platform to enhance the action in the ring. They would do this again in 2001. They would do this again in 2001 because at that point in time, Jerry Lawler quit the WWF back when it was known as the World Wrestling Federation out of protest because of them either releasing or firing the cat who I believe was his wife or was somehow related to him, but they did not want her anymore, and so they got rid of her, whether by release or by firing. And Jerry Lawler quit in protest, so they would have Paul Heyman be the voice of WWE, the commentator alongside Jim Ross. And say what you will about the Invasion storyline, but it worked wonders for their commentary because you had Jim Ross, who was representing the WWF, and you had Paul Heyman, who was representing the Alliance, which honestly worked. And then on SmackDown, you had Michael Cole, who was representing the WWF, and then you had Taz, who was representing the Alliance. So that was an interesting. That was an interesting concept. That was actually a bit of good timing on that part. Even if the Invasion storyline was hit or miss, at least that timing could have that timing was perfect when you actually think about it. With Paul at my side, I began to show him the ropes. I showed him how to fill in TV sheets and explain the rundown of a show. I thought it was a simple run-of-the-mill type gesture, but Paul didn't think so. When I looked up from the sheet, I could see Paul was a little emotional. Thank you for showing me this stuff, he said. I tried to bat his sincerity away with a joke, but he was deadly serious. There was something in him that really appreciated me taking a risk on him and showing him how a TV show was put together. As the months went on, I fought for Heyman to come with me on the Saturday night show too. Everybody else railed against it, but I was adamant that he and I had something WCW could desperately use. We had believability. Get a suit, I told him, and dye your hair. Anything else? He asked. Show up ready to fight for your life, because they're all rooting for you to fail. Good, he said. Fuck them. The next day, Paul collected me in his car and we started our drive to the office. As we pulled onto the road, I could see Heyman looking at my car, dusty in the driveway. Paul, I said, how much do you learn from me in our preparation? I learned the rhythm in psychology, he said. So, a lot. And how much do you learn in the car? How much do you learn in the car? I got 10% in the building, 50% around the locker room, and 75% from you in the car. Exactly. That's why you drive me around so much. I could see Heyman smiling. He wasn't buying it. What? Oh, you're doing me the favor by having me driving you everywhere? Exactly. And that and the fact that my license is suspended. Heyman slapped his steering wheel with excitement. I knew it! I knew something was wrong! Even though he and I were in this car alone, I still looked behind me to see if anyone could hear what I was about to say. I got caught in the second DUI. They suspended my license for 90 days. I won't say anything. I felt like shit for even putting myself in such a lousy position. I should have never driven while drunk. I knew it and learned my lesson. As well as taking my license, it also makes me pick up litter from the side of the road for 6 weeks. Even though I'd wear a semi-disguise of baseball cap and sunglasses, sometimes people would honk when they saw the chubby-headed man from TV filling his plastic bags with soda cans. I'd happily drive you around for as long as you needed, he said. I believed him, too. And then he was gone again. Another fight with the higher-ups, which resulted in Heyman going home for another stint. I still had my eye on him, though. I knew I could help direct his energy and passion in the right direction. I just had to wait until this round of heat had left Heyman's name. As soon as I saw an opening, I was going to pitch to bring him back in again. I couldn't let someone special like that just float off to the competition. Alright. Chapter 36. Changes Old and New. 1990. Near the end of the year, Dusty Rhodes returned to replace Ole as booker. I heard that Ole quit, then heard he was fired, then that he quit, but no, he was fired. Either way, the wrestling world had changed around Ole, and he didn't seem to have the tools to deal with it. WCW wrestlers had guaranteed contracts, which meant that got paid no matter if they were injured, not working hard, or taking this direction. This created a standoff, one which Ole couldn't win. His style of booking wasn't as painful to me as it was to other guys. I was used to that kind of person all the way along my wrestling journey. It was like my brain had evolved a way of dealing with confrontational, abrasive, combative alpha male types. I knew as long as I did my job well, I would get paid either way. And that's all that mattered. I had enjoyed working with Dusty in the past because he was funny and he was low maintenance. He knew what he wanted. He wrote the show. He was doing the booking. The sense around the company was that people were happy to hear Dream was coming back. Dusty was a hit maker in the sense that he had crafted many memorable and money-making angles in characters with Crockett, and in Florida before that with Professor Eddie Graham. We were all hoping he could come back and again catch that lightning in a bottle. In addition to him being booker, Dusty was also going to join me on commentary too. It was no surprise to me when he fit right in. He was charming, quick, knowledgeable of course, and most of all, entertaining. He wanted to do well because that's just that wrestler ego. He wanted to do better than all the top names in both WCW and WWF. Dusty wanted to be better than Jesse Ventura, Jim Cornette, Bobby Heenan, or Paul Heyman. And he had all the tools to do it. I sat back when he was on a verbal run and listened to him just make words up. He'd say things like, he was ugly. He wasn't ugly, but he was ugly. That's worse than ugly. You then add in his energy, delivery, and slight lisp, and Dusty was a unique package on color. We had fun and he had no issues if a match was a real slow or whatever to kind of simply jab the talent in the ring about it. Because what are they going to do? He's the booker. Dusty probably was about as stress-free to work with as anybody that I worked with. He didn't want a pre-game. He didn't want a production meeting as far as me and the announcers were concerned. He'd already thought the show through, gone over it in the truck with the director, gone over it with the talent and the agents. By the time it came down to him and me, he was tired of going over it, which suited me fine. I knew enough not to get caught out with anything. Everything else we called on the fly. If I made a left and I should have made a right, he'd get us right back to where we were going, and I would hear it and I would adapt. In between matches, we'd make each other laugh and elbow each other, and he'd remind me of the times he beat me at horse over and over again. I'm still not stupid enough to beat the booker, I said. You're still smart then, he replied. Of all the matches and all the talent we saw, both Dusty and I agreed that there was one kid who had something special. He reminded us of a linebacker in the way he looked. Big, rugged, blonde hair. You could tell he was an athlete. He walked like an athlete, and he carried himself like an athlete. He was intense from the get-go. I couldn't tell if it was nerves because he was new and had gotten a big break from starving in Tennessee, or whether he was always that intense. He came from Dallas, or Peyton Place as it was called, because there was always some drama, some soap opera down there. That territory was unraveling with all the issues that were going on with personal lives and the lack of institutional control in the booking office and things of that nature. Steve Austin probably was happy to get away from some of that insanity. Little did he know that WCW bathed in its own brand of craziness. Steve Austin! We're going to be hearing about him many times throughout this book, and probably the sequel book as well, but we'll get to that when we get to it. He was motivated, excited to compete. You could tell from the beginning that his mindset was, I'm going to become somebody. WCW was a fresh start for him, but he never struck me as a guy who was just happy to be there. He always had this game face on, and I think that came from a lot of the fact that he was an overachieving football player who was a big star in high school. He played linebacker in Wharton Junior College in Texas, and then he got that scholarship to North Texas State in Denton, Texas. Then he got the wrestling bug after watching the World Class Championship Wrestling. He saw commercials for the Chris Adams Wrestling School, and he took a job on the freight dock to earn the money to attend. That not only got him trained, but booked too. Steve told me he lived way outside of Atlanta, kind of away from everybody. He was a loner. I could see that he had made friends with Brian Pillman, which I thought was kind of the odd couple. Pillman was loud and extroverted, and Steve seemed to be a bit more reserved. A cool hand Luke kind of person. As time moved on, I thought they made a very good team on and off screen. The Dangerous Alliance was a big break for Steve because he was very non-political. He needed something to give him an identity and give him a little bit of a political foundation, and having the rehired Paul Heyman as a spokesman meant he was always going to get great ideas because Paul was always thinking. He had a group of guys there that were good independent thinkers as well. Rick Rude, Larry Zbyszko, and Arn Anderson, who had been big stars in their own rights, and you add Steve to that group, the youngest of the crew, who was kind of really the guy that was going to get the big rub at the end of all that. Then you had Medusa adding sex appeal and the female component to the mix. And with the great young manager in Heyman, it was a very good booking by Dusty. You had Larry, who WCW had nothing for. You had Austin, who they had nothing for really to speak of, in lieu of some of this stuff with Pillman for a while. And Dusty had confidence and knew about how good Arn was. Dream knew how Heyman was a heat-seeking missile as a manager. And there weren't a lot of women, so adding Medusa to the group was a great move as she was a brilliant heel. If they had stayed together over a longer period of time, they probably would have gone and been considered one of the more prolific factions ever. And Austin was a keeper. He just had something that was worth keeping an eye on. It seemed Dallas was a rich vein for new talent around this time, but WCW didn't have a great track record of bringing that talent along and getting the most for their money. WCW was good at hiring guys with potential, then doing nothing with them. Mark Calloway was a great example of this. He was wrestling in Dallas as the Masked Punisher, but I knew no one in that promotion was making a lot, so I saw money in him right away. You don't see too many 6'9" guys that can move around as athletically as he could. With us, he was making about 150 grand a year, downside, and his contract came up for renewal. Ole was booking at the time, and I said we needed to address Calloway's contract. Well, he's never going to draw a dime, Ole said. Well, if that's your opinion, you're going to miss the boat on this guy, I replied. I don't want to hear another fucking word about it. I talked to Mark, and the word on the street was that McMahon was romancing him. I couldn't understand Ole's thinking, and it was the only time I pushed him so far that I thought he was going to punch me. As I saw it, you couldn't coach big. He was a legit athlete. He was 6'9", 300 pounds. The kind of guy that walks through the airport and everybody looks it. So he's what bookers generally clamor for. He was a head turner, and Mark was a great guy, very down to earth and very unpretentious. He was kind of laid back, actually. Only thought that Mark was just another big guy that hadn't found himself, and therefore wasn't going to draw any money. You think they're going to give me anything here, Jim? Mark asked. Well, if the booker has no faith in you, why would you stay? I said. I don't need to know your business, and I don't want to know your business. But if you have the opportunity to go someplace else based on what I know, I would explore it seriously. Soon after, I saw him on WWF TV working as The Undertaker. Dallas Stevie also brought a young Mick Foley to my attention. I was in equal parts fascinated by him and worried for him. He did the running elbow off the ring apron to the floor, and that was one of the coolest and riskiest moves I had ever seen. In the context of the show, it looked devastating for Mick's opponents. In the context of it being a human body facilitating the move, it looked devastating for Mick Foley. As part of my job, I used to watch wrestling shows from the other territories in marathon sessions. Hours and hours of TV, countless moves, wrestlers, promos, and personalities, and Mick Foley stood out. And it wasn't just his risky moves and daredevil dives. It was his persona under the character. Mick Foley as Cactus Jack worked equally well bell to bell or on the microphone. He was compelling with the volume up or down. I knew I wanted him to come to WCW. Chapter 37, Japan, 1991. Jan and I were kind of moved in together. I was still an asshole afraid to commit, so she moved out again. I missed her more than anything, and I knew I was in danger of losing who I was and what I wanted. She was eager to move our relationship forward, but as someone in the twice married, twice failed club, I was in no rush to pull that lever again. As usual, just as she was packing her bags, I was packing mine too. It was time for my first trip to Japan for WCW's co-promotion with New Japan Pro Wrestling, WCW New Japan Super Show. Will you stay until I get back? I asked her. We could talk more about this then. She was quiet but resolute. I know what I want from life, and this isn't it, she said. Jan went her way and I went mine. I didn't want her to go, not even a little bit, but I couldn't help but hear my father's voice saying, Son, you're not the marrying kind. On arrival in Japan, we were split into groups and assigned a host who would look after us during our trip. Ours had a partly missing digit, which I would grow to learn meant he was a made man, a representative of the Yakuza. My group was Ric Flair, Rick and Scott Steiner, Tony Schiavone, and myself. On the night before the big show, we were taken to a great place for the best steaks I have ever tasted. From there, we were taken to the bathhouse to get a massage. Some of the women that worked there were second or third generation and had a very strict set of rules. For instance, they would not tend to anyone with tattoos, which would have left the Steiners out. Our host, however, had a friendly chat with the owner of the establishment, and the rule was relaxed for the evening. Yeah, remember, this guy is a member of the Yakuza. What do you think was being said there? Probably some threats, maybe? When we left the Bats, we went to a nightclub where Jim Hurd, our boss who chewed me out for damaging the company's reputation, got up on stage and drunkenly sang Chuck Berry tunes. At this point, I just wanted to go to the hotel. I was in this phase of drink, noise, women, decadence, and debauchery, and it didn't sit well with me. I didn't know if I was uncomfortable because this wasn't who I was, or because it was who I was now. Just as the parade of ladies was being led into the bar, I found our host and asked him to arrange a ride for me back to the hotel. I was just looking for a cab, but he arranged a bodyguard and a driver. Outside the place, my car pulled up, a Corniche Rolls-Royce convertible, and I was driven around the city by my driver with a bodyguard right out of The Sopranos, sitting snugly against me in the back. They made sure they put the top down, even though I was freezing my ass off. I smiled at both men all the way back to my hotel, through chattering teeth. The lights, the buildings, the food and drink. The ladies, the money, the travel, the car. It was never more apparent to me just how far away from the farm I was. Thank God I was not involved in any of the political nightmare finishes the next day. NJPW's local star, Tatsumi Fujinami, was going to win the NWA title from Flair in the packed Tokyo Dome. Tony Schiavone and I did some wraparounds for in the upper deck with the camera shooting us where the backdrop was the fans and the ring, and from those seats the ring looked like a little dot way down the middle of the building. It was an amazing scene. We could relax and soak it in because we didn't have to voice over the show until we got back to the States. As I watched the main event, I couldn't understand the political issues that we had on our end about Flair losing to Fujinami. New Japan wanted to get in bed with WCW, and they wanted to work with Ted Turner as a group. I couldn't understand how it would hurt our champion or our title to lose to somebody else's finish, especially when the plan all along was for Flair to get it back in a pay-per-view the following month. In the middle of all the political nonsense, the finish of the match ended up being confusing and overly complicated. Flair lost, so the Japanese audience believed the NWA heavyweight title went to their local hero. But the US audience was told that Fujinami was already disqualified for throwing Flair over the top rope before the pinfall, so the belt didn't change hands. In the US, Flair kept the belt, but in Japan, he didn't keep the belt. It was just a train wreck. WCW should have trusted Schiavone and me to protect Flair and lose him. We could have told the great story of Flair's travel and the matches he had before he left the States, the jet lag, and Fujinami having home crowd advantage. We would have sold it like Fujinami barely caught Rick with a 1-2-3 that could have gone either way. We could have built it to a huge rematch the following month. The long-term relationship of New Japan and WCW was adversely affected by the politics of the day involving the NWA title, and Flair was talking about leaving. Chapter 38. Flair leaves. 1991. Flair finally left. The primary issue was that Rick and Dusty had a nice professional rivalry, that they generally kept subdued and under control, but the wild card in that whole equation was Hurd. Hurd had definite feelings about Rick. Heard wanted changes and wanted younger and new stars developed, and we kept feeding the viewer the same show. The menu never changed. And Heard, for the sake of change, wanted change. To change for the sake of change wasn't good in business as a rule. So if you want to change, what's our plan? Well, change into what? That's going to make us better. Why? Heard wanted to change Rick's persona, and Rick was offended by the fact that he wanted him to change. I totally saw Rick's dilemma. It was like asking Sandy Koufax to start throwing right-handed, and he's the greatest left-hander of all time in the eyes of many. That's how Rick looked at his game. I'm Ric Flair. Why do I need a change? Heard didn't have the same feel for the business. He looked at Ric Flair like he was a long-time incumbent, and it was time for him to pass the torch. There was a very distinct, stark difference in philosophy and opinion between the two men. Their lack of communication with each other allowed the problem to manifest itself into an unsolvable issue, where eventually there was no solution left on the table. And their tensions were present in the company every day. The people in the office got it from Heard, and the people on the roster got it from Flair. In the end, people got tired of it. It almost alienated Rick from a lot of people that worked there because they had to live with Heard. Rick was in Charlotte at his mansion working with his lawyers, while a lot of us were sequestered on Heard's floor at the office, so it just got to be unbearable. Solve the problem, for God's sake. Fix your issues. Come to some sort of middle ground. Can you compromise? Is there anything whatsoever that can be done to eliminate this problem? Get a mediator. Do something, instead of just continuing to wear it out with rhetoric. Ric Flair is no longer with this company, Heard said to me. He's gone? I asked. Even though I knew all of this troubles between both men, I was sad the great Ric Flair had finally been broken and forced out. He's gone. Good riddance, Heard said. By the way, you ever hear of anyone walking with the title? Why? I asked. No reason. Rick left all right and took the heavyweight title with him, as in the actual bout itself. He had laid a $25,000 deposit on the strap per the instruction of the NWA. Ironically, it was an older rule that was born out of paranoia that a heavyweight champion could walk once he won the title. In Flair's mind, he paid for the bout and it was his. I don't think Heard even was aware of the deposit or the legalities of who owned what. It was a sad day when Rick left. It was also unfortunate, and we were all going to miss him because he was one of those social guys that loved to have fun and was always the life of the party. He was the company's social ambassador and a large part of the face of WCW, and with him gone, a huge part of the NWA legacy, and had now gone to work for the competition. It just didn't feel right. Chapter 39, Changing of the Guard, 1992. Not surprisingly, Heard was the next to go. It's just not worth it, he said as he packed up his desk. This place has taken years off my life. I'm going home. I knew the constant internal battles were tearing him up and that he was reaching the point of having to step away. He was butting heads with Dusty on as Booker and getting frustrated with WCW in general. Heard was facing the near impossible task for someone who had years of wrestling experience. Never mind someone like him who had none. After he left, TBS named K. Allen Frey as WCW's new lead executive. I liked Frey, who asked everyone to call him Kip. He was a smart guy, having earned a law degree at Duke University. He was a big basketball fan and was a genuinely nice man, who immediately tried to foster a positive work environment. Unfortunately, he lacked the one thing he needed most in his new role. He had virtually no product knowledge and was easily manipulated. He had never been a fan. I don't mean that he hated the business, as so many of the holier-than-thou Turner executives did. Wrestling simply had never registered with him, and for a guy who was so bright, he's probably thought nothing of having to manage a crew of wrestlers beyond the fact that he got to be a department head, which would in turn be a stepping stone to someone more significant within Turner Broadcasting. Kip's other major problem went hand in hand with not being familiar with wrestling, managing the wrestlers. He was too trusting, not understanding that when you had a roster of wrestling talents in that era, it was going to have its fair share of con men. A lot of the guys had the instinct to spot a weakness and the willingness to pounce if they thought they could get something out of it. Some of the guys got contracts or perks that would never have flown with someone more savvy to how the business operates. Frey was one of the first in wrestling to offer guaranteed contracts, which would prove to be a disservice to the company and even to the wrestlers themselves. Paying wrestlers based on the strength of the business gave the wrestlers the thing all athletes needed most, the motivation to keep getting better. WCW's guaranteed contracts paid as much for an empty arena as for a sellout. I thought it was a concept that wouldn't work that successfully. However, he did create an incentive that was new and innovative. He gave out bonuses for the guys who delivered the best performance of the pay-per-views and clashes. This helped level out some of the comfortable matches the guaranteed contracts helped usher in. Kip also scored something of a get when he brought in Jesse the Body Ventura to be the color commentator on pay-per-views. Although he wasn't the first commentator to advocate for wrestling's villains, Watts had Mid-South villains filling in as early as 1980, and Roddy Piper was doing the same a year later on TBS for Georgia Championship Wrestling. Jesse was the one who popularized the role. I left Oklahoma with the plan of never living with regret, but the way I handled my working relationship with Jesse was something I regretted and wasn't proud of. Frey signed Jesse to an extraordinary salary for which Jesse would only have to work a small amount of dates. He was only fresh in the door and was earning a huge amount more than I was, even though I was doing all the pay-per-views and 52 weeks of TV shows a year. The disparity made me furious, and as a result, I was standoffish with Jesse right from the start. I don't know why I blamed Jesse for getting the big money. I should have blamed myself. I didn't have the right negotiation plan in place. I should have had a plan for how to talk to Frey about how much money Ventura was earning versus what I was earning for the amount of work I was doing. Ultimately, it was wrestlers taking advantage of Kip, which led to his exit. He was always doing his best to appease everyone, but in our business, that just means the guys are going to walk all over you. In May 1992, after only a short time with the company, Kip told a handful of folks individually that he was leaving. I was still working in the office all the time, in addition to broadcasting, so I was one of those he personally told. What would you think of me going for the job? I asked Jan. Ever since we'd split up, I would call her off and on. We became better friends over the phone than we seemingly did when we lived together. The department head? She asked. Yeah. Frey says he's leaving, and I think I have the experience now to make something good of the company. I think you should do it, she said. I was a little embarrassed even bringing it up. Wrestling and my obsession for it was one of the reasons that Jan and I had split. You think I could do it? I asked. Jim, I've never met anyone who loves their profession as much as you love yours, she replied. Why not you? She was right. Why not me indeed? You miss me yet? I asked. Yes. You want to try again? No. Can I ask you again sometime? Yes. I loved her, and I missed her. And I could hear she missed me too. I walked into the CNN building with my plan laid out and my pitch in mind. A lot of people didn't even know Kip was going to leave, so I felt that I might have a step ahead of whoever else was considering throwing their hat in the ring. I really felt that learning all those different roles under Bill Watts in my early years made me as good a candidate as anyone to be the next head of WCW. I had many years of experience in virtually every area of the business, from the communication, handling public relations, writing publicity stories and radio ads, to working with the building managers, recruiting talent, negotiating with talent, booking live events, doing the payoffs, booking pay-per-view cards, and writing and formatting television shows. I did all those things even within the unique world of wrestling. My education was novel. I hadn't heard of too many people in the business who had experience in all those different departments. Not a lot of people knew Kip was leaving, but none of us seemed to know that his replacement was already in place. Cowboy Bill Watts. Since Bill sold the UWF in 1987, we had tried to stay in touch with each other, but with him out of the business for 5 years, that dwindled to where we stayed where we're staying in contact about as much as anybody in the wrestling business stays in touch. Not much. I found the wrestling business funny that way as far as relationships go. I still remember my first road trip with Danny and Akbar when they told me that even after a long career, once I got out on the wrestling business, I would be lucky to be able to count my good friends in the wrestling business on one hand. I thought they were just crabby bastards. Lo and behold, now that I was almost 20 years into the business, I was the crabby bastard saying that to the younger wrestlers. When people in wrestling separate, especially geographically, they rarely stay in that close of touch because everyone is focused on the new job, the new roster. Bill and I would talk sporadically, maybe 3 or 4 times a year on the phone, but my relationship with him was different than most because he was a genuine mentor to me and taught me principles of the wrestling business that I had used for my whole career. And he was now sitting in the seat in WCW. Jimbo! He shouted when he saw me in the doorway. Bill? Come in! He could see I was a little bewildered. I wanted to call you and tell you, he said, but they made me give my word that I wouldn't tell anybody, so I kept my word. You know how that goes. I nodded because that was always true of Bill. When he told you he was going to do something, then he was going to do it. Take a seat, he said, and tell me about this place. I gave him the lay of the land as best I could, about job descriptions, telling him who people were, etc. He asked a lot of questions about everything under the sun. The booking, when the deadlines were for ads, and promotional stuff, a lot of the fundamental things. I don't care what they think here in these offices, he said. I'm going to do it my way, no matter the cost. And I knew with those few words that Bill's time in WCW wouldn't be long. He had an old school wrestling mentality in the new school corporate world, and I had already witnessed how that worked for Ole. They want me to cut costs around here. Big cuts. Where are you going to start? I asked. The system of Cowboy's new department and how TBS structured it was built for failure. The upper management just didn't seem to care who had answers, or if there were answers. They were just thinking about how much money WCW was losing, and when some soon the North Tower decided the guy on top of WCW had lost just about enough, TBS would just replace that guy with another guy. Watts with the new other guy. I also saw my own potential headaches when various boys in the locker room began saying things like, "Why didn't you say something about Bill coming in? I can't believe you didn't tell me." I said I didn't know, 'cause I didn't know. The reply was some variation of, "Aw, come on, you're Watts' boy." They couldn't believe it, but I had no idea. Now all of a sudden I was looked at suspiciously. On one hand, they wouldn't believe me when I said I didn't know, and on the other hand, I was now seen as Watts' lieutenant who was double dealing on hiding things from the boys. Everyone knew there was a new sheriff in town and things were going to change. How things were going to change, nobody could guess. But there was definitely change in the air, and they wanted me to tell them exactly when these changes were, even though I had no clue. Everyone could tell that TBS hired the wrong guy with Jim Herd. He was truly a decent man who had some ill-advised ideas. Hunchbacks, ding-dongs, some of that stuff. At the end, he wanted the great Ric Flair to become the Gladiator, cutting his hair and wearing an earring. Whatever WWF was doing that Herd saw and thought he might be able to copy, then that's what we did, or he wanted to do. Watts, on the other hand, had plenty of experience and product knowledge, but his first task set by the company wasn't anything to do with the wrestling end of things. His marching orders were to reduce the budget and the losses immensely, and to do it yesterday. This made Cowboy very challenging to work for. Bill was so accustomed to calling the shots and not being second-guessed that in his own way, he was as unprepared to deal with the corporate people as the corporate people who came before him had been unprepared to deal with the wrestlers. Watts immediately butted heads with Bill Shaw, one of the TBS executives who sat higher on the corporate food chain than us peasants in WCW. Bob Dew, who had managed the Omni, Atlanta's premier indoor arena, and the site for major wrestling shows in the area, ended up being the buffer between the two Bills. Dew loved to have a cocktail and play golf. He took things with an attitude of easy come, easy go, which also meant he was usually happy to take the path of least resistance. But he didn't know a damn thing about the pro wrestling business either, though he was a hell of a lot better to deal with than Bill Shaw. Shaw was like the evil Andy of Mayberry from the Andy Griffith Show. He managed a number of divisions for TBS, and the last thing he seemed to want to do was lower himself into having to deal with the carnival freaks of WCW. I thought after one of his visits hand sanitizers installed outside of the door of the WCW offices so he could cleanse himself on the way out. Shaw used to tell us how other people at TBS didn't understand why Turner was in the wrestling business at all. But the ratings were very competitive, and it was wrestling programming, which meant it was somewhat cheap to produce and was first run original programming. Watts was reducing the costs, but making waves everywhere he went. He even restructured my contract to give me to give me more work on the office side of things. He got my job description listed on my contract and put in a significant pay bump which reflected my new responsibilities. He clearly wanted me to fill in my old Mid-South slot of being his man on the ground, but I could see from 100 miles away that it was a poisoned chalice. I didn't want to tell Cowboy that I just couldn't see how an individualist like him was going to work out long term. I saw him more as being a great consultant, coming in and working for a week or a month, troubleshooting problems, offering some creative quality control, and helping get things restructured when they went off the rails. Bill did some good things. He also did some things that people didn't understand. I loved Bill. He was my mentor and family to me. He was the most influential person I'd known in my career. But his tenure at WCW was really was detrimental to me professionally. It was guilt by association. There was always there was always volatility and hostility. He came to work angry a lot, and I was his confidant. I was his guy, which I wasn't ashamed of. There were also some swirling statements that Watts made some years before that were coming back to haunt him. I sat under Bill's learning tree and knew he wasn't a racist. I saw the very personal relationship he had with his black booker Ernie Ladd and his top star, another African American, the Junkyard Dog, which other white promoters would never do in that era. He was also proud to put the WCW World title on Ron Simmons. But him leaving was all about TBS and nothing to do with anything else. He'd come in, shook up the entire division in good ways and plenty of bad, literally pissed off the 12th floor balcony when he felt like it, and then left again. And when he was gone, I was ostracized. The guy that taught me more than anybody in the wrestling was the guy who had inadvertently derailed my WCW career. There was absolutely no way the brass was going to consider another Watts-type wrestling person in the vacant position, and, fairly or not, that meant my career in that direction was dead in the water. I needed to start thinking about another path. Chapter 40. My Last Days at WCW, 1993. Watts' vacant role ultimately went to Eric Bischoff. Eric was a wrestling guy who came from the AWA, but very smartly sold himself as the exact opposite. After having Ole and Watts at the helm, Turner had no appetite for another old-school, headstrong type leading the charge. So Eric pitched himself as a brand bolder, a businessman with an overall vision for consistency after all the changes to the company. He was young, handsome, and just the type of antidote to Watts that the brass wanted. He had served his time at WCW as an announcer who mostly worked on the lower shows, But when the time came to make this case with the head of the department, he positioned himself brilliantly. Eric had street smarts and amazing ambition. Bill Shaw brought me over to his office and told me about the various gripes he had with Watts, from his bombastic nature all the way down to WCW booking Cowboy's son, Eric, as a wrestler. Bill Watts has cast a big shadow around here, he said, and you're still standing right under it. I'm my own man, I replied. I kinda knew that trying to argue my case was useless. I had already said everything I could say and did everything I could do. But it was like my nearly 20 years in the business didn't mean anything. I was being judged by another man's actions. Shaw continued. So here's your options from here on out. You take 6 weeks off to let things cool down. I don't want to. Just hear me out, he said. We'll continue to pay you and you come back when the bad taste is gone out of the place. I didn't want to go anywhere. I knew what it would look like if I followed Watts out the door, even short term. What's my other option? I asked. Well, you accept your reassignment. You keep your official title as Vice President of Broadcasting. But you'll be working in syndication sales, traveling nationwide and market WCW shows to various local TV affiliates across the country, he said. You'll also be working behind the scenes with the announcers on the Sunday WCW show on TBS. The show I had created. I felt like Leroy McGurk's smoldering testicles. He continued. If you take the 6 weeks, I might be able to get you back on the air when you get back. Shaw knew that was the position I wanted to keep most. How are you going to get me back on the air? I asked. But Bischoff specifically said he doesn't want me calling the shows. You don't have to worry about Bischoff, Shaw replied. He works for me. I immediately saw how this would work out. I could have turned the meeting into a confrontation, and he would probably have put me back on the air. But it would have been some Mickey Mouse obscure demeaning role, which would not only piss me off, but would piss Bischoff off as well, because Eric didn't want me on anything. I was around since day one and seen as the old guard, one of the wrestling guys. Eric wanted a fresh start, and I understood that completely. Ironically, Watts a few months before had wanted me to fire Eric. Eric was our C announcer who handled the smaller shows and did the grunt work in terms of announcing. I don't like him, Cowboy said. He's an asshole. An asshole who answers to you, so get rid of him. What did he do? I asked. Nothing. I need to send a message. Well, then I can't do it, I said. Eric does a good job and we have no reason to blame corporate for firing him. Eric stayed, and now I was on the chopping block. Shaw said, Look, this is what I would do if I was you. I would take the 6 weeks off. We're going to pay you anyway, and see what you think then. You don't have to take the syndication thing, but we're offering you a job over here that needs some help. And if you don't want to do the syndication job, just take another 6 weeks, because we're going to keep paying you. The company didn't want me to stay, but knew I had a contract, which raised a major problem for TBS. When they re-signed me under Watts, a raise was not all I got. I also received a guaranteed deal to be the voice of the Saturday night TBS show, the Clash of Champions specials, and the pay-per-views. At the time, TBS had wanted to lock me in those roles, so their own lawyer put in writing my job specification. When my lawyer looked at it, he said, You need to sign this right away because you're locked into prime time. It's like being the host of Monday Night Football, and that's your gig. And if they don't want you to be the host of Monday Night Football anymore, they have to pay you your full contract. By having me out on vacation or traveling around with syndication sales, I simply wasn't going to be around the company. I was being sent out to the hinterlands to be forgotten until my deal ran out 3 years later. So I took the 6 weeks and went to Jamaica alone. Bad idea. After someone back to the States, the mere smell of rum made me ill. It was the first vacation I'd taken in years. Problem was, I was bored just 2 weeks in. I called Jan a lot and I felt like we were getting even closer. I told her what was happening and she was an amazing confidant who I missed dearly. I looked forward to talking with her about just about anything in my life. But I wasn't the kind for sitting around. I didn't want I didn't want the money for nothing. I wanted to work for it. I wanted to earn it. Better to die of work than rust. When I came back, I decided to give the syndication and production job a try. I did get to keep one of my broadcasting jobs, too. Little did I know that my weekly report on WCW's 900 number on Saturdays was making a small fortune, and, of course, I got none of that money. Traveling around and going to the local TV stations and pitching the WCW syndicated programming was soul-destroying. I knew where I wanted to be. I knew I had much more to offer on TV. I'd gotten enough attention from fans from my work over the years, and I ended up getting the same questions over and over. Jim, how come you're not on TV anymore? It just became embarrassing, and I had enough. I'd watched the talent after talent, person after person, travel north to WWF over the years. It was my turn to try and do the same. Next time on Slobberknocker, My Life is Wrestling. Part 6, WWF, 1993 to 99. This covers Chapter 41, Vince. Chapter 42, WCW Radio. Chapter 43, WrestleMania 9. Chapter 44, Growing Pains. Chapter 45, Making Friends. Chapter 46, In Sickness and in Health. Chapter 47, In and Out. Chapter 48, Vincent Good Old JR. Chapter 49, The New and the Old. Chapter 50, Market Research. Chapter 51, Back to Announcing. Chapter 52, Changing Roles. Chapter 53, The JJ Role. Chapter 54, Talent. Chapter 55, The Black Hat. Chapter 56, So Long Dad. Chapter 57, Sitting Down with Foley. Chapter 58, Pillman. Chapter 59, Montreal. Because you know we're going to be you knew we were going to be talking about that. Chapter 60, A Little More Attitude. Chapter 61, Hell in a Cell. Chapter 62, Second Attack. Chapter 63, Coming Home. And then the afterword by Stone Cold Steve Austin. So yeah, and then acknowledgements. So yeah, this is going to run from page 215 to just barely to 325. So about 110 pages we're going to be having to read here. That's going to be fun. Thankfully, because of that, tomorrow we will be reading Percy Jackson and the Olympians. And for a brief preview of that, we're reading chapters 15 through 19. The chapters being A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers. Chapter 15, A God Buys Us Cheeseburgers. Chapter 16, We Take a Zebra to Vegas. Chapter 17, We Shop for Waterbeds. Chapter 18, Annabeth Does Obedience School. And Chapter 19, We Find Out the Truth, sort of. So yes, we got a lot to look. I got something to look forward to when we read this book. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this reading stream. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is Forrest Walpole, signing off.